So right now, I'm sewing the trim on. And the first pass I'm doing with the trim right side down so that I can just use a running stitch to go through everything. It's much faster than trying to turn it under from the right side, at least for the first pass. The second pass, I'm going to need to, fold it back and turn it under very carefully. But this one, I want to get done a little bit faster, so I can just treat it more like a running stitched seam instead of carefully felling it down from the outside. The end result will still look the same, but this is ultimately going to save me probably about 20 minutes of work. And when you're making clothes completely by hand, the 20 minutes is very important. So if you joined me before the beginning of the video, you've probably seen that this is just the first piece of trim down one of the fronts. And then before I do the second pass, just to, again, to save myself time and energy, I'm going to go through this piece of trim. I'm just going to really quickly tack the seam allowance back so that I don't have to fight it when I'm trying to turn. This particular organza that the embroidery is done on does not press well, So it's easier for me to just stitch it down. And they can be big, sloppy stitches as long as they just catch the back of the embroidery and they don't go through to the front. So you can see it's just been turned back so that I don't have to fight so much to control it when I'm doing the final pass along the edge. Okay, I need a fresh piece of thread. Sorry, I know this part can be a little boring, but it's necessary if we're going to do the next step accurately. Almost done. Okay. Thank goodness that's over. Now I can move on to to folding the trim the other direction and stitching down the other side of it. This is very fiddly. It's hard to keep a good grip on it when it's at this angle. If I'd had a little more forethought, I probably would have stitched the other side with the running stitch first. This one that I'm working on now is the one that I should have done with running stitch, so that I could have the weight of the garment in my lap instead of hanging off the other side of my knee. When it's hanging off the side of my knee and all I've got is an edge right here, it just makes the whole thing move way too much and makes it very inconvenient um, to work because you're constantly wasting energy trying to keep the fabric properly arranged on your lap. I'm really kind of unhappy with the way this trim is going on. I just don't like the way that it's folded. I don't like the organza underneath. So it's fine for the purposes of making this sample to test my layout and to prove some of my assumptions and theories. However, it's proving to be a little bit fussier than I'd really like. And the inconsistent black edge that keeps sort of popping into and out of existence on this side doesn't look good at all. So I need to make a new thread, so I'm just going to fasten off here on the inside. Okay, the first line of trim is now on. Not exceptionally thrilled with it, but I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press it from the back side and see how it looks. And then I'm going to attempt to get the other pieces of trim to press properly. I don't have high hopes, but I feel like it'll be less of a fight if I can get even a little bit of trim to work. Alright? So I'll move over to the ironing board now. I'm going to give the iron a couple minutes to heat up. There's a couple of ways to deal with the wobbly black edge that I don't like. Part of it is that the black edge that's causing the problem is actually a stitch. This trim was machine embroidered using one of those decorative embroidery stitches that you get on your domestic sewing machine. And the black just wasn't done very well, so it's a little bit irregular, and so it's pushing out against the fold where I want it to be clean. So my solution for that would be to probably add like a piece of bias tape next to the edge, or yes, possibly couch a cord next to it, which is a totally typical period treatment. I'm not doing that for this, or at least not yet. I might do it later after all the trim is on and then decide if I want to put extra work into this. Because really this skirt's only purpose is to serve as an example for what this garment's supposed to look like, and then it'll get photographed for the Modern Maker Volume 2. It just may not be worth it to go to extra great lengths with this particular piece. I mean, it looks alright. I don't hate it, but, you know, I've seen better. So I'm going to try to press the trim now and see if I can get it to look any more clean. First, we'll start by giving it a good press from the back side to try to even it out a little bit. Going to reduce the iron temperature because I don't know what kind of synthetics they use to make this. Okay, so that part is done. Oh yeah, that's not working at all. It actually works better if I try to do both sides at once, because then I can pull them in tension and they fall where they're supposed to. I mean, it looks a little better. I can live with it. Alright, so I'm going to use this band for the second band in on the left front. So this was the right front that I just did. So now I'm going to use this fresh one for the left. Here we are. And it's hard to see because I used the same color thread as the fabric, but there's a little line right here, which is the basting line from putting in the hem stiffener, and I know that that's where the center of my next piece of trim, my hem trim is going to go. So I'm using that as my alignment point for this, so that when I turn the corner after doing the exterior edge, I'm going to turn the corner on the right front, turn the corner and cover this end of trim. And I'm just using a few small pins just to keep it in place, because I don't want to baste on top of the beading, because the beading is going to catch all the threads on the basting and just make it sad and unfriendly to work with. So just a few pins, like maybe 4 or 5 total, to just keep it where it belongs. There's a lot that we don't know about this type of skirt. We don't really know whether it was strictly as an underskirt, whether it was used in an underskirt in some countries and as a regular skirt in other countries. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we just don't have a lot of surviving examples. There are skirts with a similar round cut that are used in every century. Um, Particularly in the 19th century, you see what they call an umbrella skirt that really has this very round feeling to it. and it was used as an outer skirt. Not that the 19th century is any way that we can pass judgment on that, but it gives us an idea of the fact that it wasn't considered out of place during certain eras to use it as an outside uh, layer. So, just something to think about, like how very different are we from these people back then when it comes to deciding what layers to put on the outside. If the skirt's beautiful and very well made and it's embellished, there's no reason why it couldn't be on the outside. It's not as though there were rules that said this cut of skirt can only be used for the inside or for the underwear layer. At least there aren't any rules that I've seen. We're moving back over to the work table. Since I pressed this so carefully, it now has become slightly inconvenient to flip it back and do the running stitch thing that I did on the first pass. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch both sides the same way, but I'm going to start with the interior edge so that I can get the awkward bit done first. Are there any more questions about what I'm doing and why? So again, I'm just going to the back of the work. I'm taking a couple of stitches in one spot so that I can tie off and add a fresh thread. Yeah, I mean, tangles are pretty common when you do that. The trick to avoiding the tangles um, is to use a slightly larger gauge needle, which gives you a bigger hole, which has less tendency to push the twist down the thread. And then also wax and press your thread before you stitch with it. I don't always like to take the time to wax and press, so oftentimes I'll just take one stitch at a time just to avoid it. It's a little bit lazy, and I could probably save myself some time, but I think at this point, the time savings for me is kind of negligible. What other thread conditioner would they have used in period but wax? I think a lot of the modern stuff is way too much chemical for me. I would rather just iron my thread. One pass down, one to go. The second one's always easier than the first because you're not fighting the movement of the trim. It stays put. I don't know if you can see the back of that. Okay, well, let me flip this around. To answer your question, Vicky, I use a variety of different threads. Right now I'm using a glacé cotton thread, like it's a thread that we use in tailoring a lot. It's called Highmark. It is not a period thread, but it's pre-finished so that it has a nice smooth surface on it and it makes it a lot easier to stitch with. Um, and yes, I do change the type of thread that I use depending on the application. Some portions of a garment require linen threads, other portions require the silk threads. Anywhere that it's going to be seen, I'm either using high mark like this, or I'm using black silk finishing thread, or silk finishing thread, whatever the color is that I need. I have to say it's going much more smoothly since I decided to press down the edges of the trim. It's still a little bit uneven, but so were the garments from period. There's a lot of uneven work when you look at the extant pieces, and that has something to do with them being hundreds of years old, but still. Some of the stitching work itself is not as accurate as we would expect it to be were it made today. I did have pins on the first pass, Sunny. I just didn't use very many. Um, very, very few. And I always pull them out a few inches before I get to them because they get in my way. But I also, if I've got a line to follow, I don't necessarily need to pin in place. In fact, I'd rather avoid pinning if I can because it wastes time and energy. I know a lot of people are obsessive pinners, so I can understand. Um, I can understand where that comes from. I really like. I try to avoid it as much as possible. There are several things that I was thinking about doing with this trim to avoid using pins altogether. Well, there weren't that many pins. I only had 4 or 5 of them in the piece just to get it in place, so I think they were probably easy to miss with the choppiness of the image. Well, the easiest thing would have been to actually baste it from the back side, where I do my basting line, and I might throw a pin or two onto the surface just to hold it for a second, and then turn it over. And actually, using a black thread that matches the trim, I would have quickly like basted down the center of the trim, just using my fingers to sort of feel where it was on the outside. But the only problem with that is it makes it oftentimes very difficult to be accurate with lining up. And I figured since I was busy talking and trying to demonstrate online here today, that it would be best if I didn't do something which required so much concentration. That's really the biggest one. I mean, there are other ways to apply trim. Like I have a fusible web that I could have used, like just to lay it down and glue it in place. But that's more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so this is on now. I'm going to go back to the iron and I'm going to give it a press. Because I don't have very much trim and I may actually not quite have enough for this project, I may be a few inches short. I decided not to worry about whether the patterns of the trim were aligned at center front because I can't afford to lose any trim to having to shift it one way or another. So I think what I'm going to do, since I'm not sure if I'm going to have enough trim, I'm going to lay what trim I do have along the hem to make sure that that at least stays consistent. That way, if I want to use a totally different trim with at center front for the overlap placket, I can. Okay, so this piece of trim is going to start right here. I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna go ahead and press what's left of my trim. Just trying to let this cool for a minute. Okay, that's done. Now I'm going to go ahead and check it. I think we should be okay at least to get the whole hem in. I just don't know about the extra length for the center front. So we're going to answer that question. Okay. There's that. Ooh, it's not looking good. We'll see. Not quite. So we are about 24 inches short of having the right amount of trim for this project to go around the hem. I thought I had enough. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and put all the trim on that I have, and then uh, probably tomorrow morning I will stitch up a nice little kind of fakey duplicate of this to just extend what I have. And I'll still use a different trim for center front because I don't really want to spend time doing like 2 full yards of hand embroidered trim when I really just need to finish this project. So it should be interesting finding out how close a duplicate I can create. You know, there's the other possibility that I could just go back to the store to buy more, but that's all the way in Manhattan, and that's a frustrating place to go sometimes. I hope this is continuing to be entertaining for you. I know some of these steps can seem to take forever, especially because it's sewn by hand. There is another option for the trim, I just realized. I was doing some experimentation with uh, hand embroidery a few weeks ago, and I worked up some uh, gold and silver trim on a black strip on black fabric. So what I could theoretically do is remove the two strips from center front and use the excess to fill in the hem, and then use the the delicately hand embroidered stuff down the front. So it's going to be more or less the same appearance. Uh, I'm not really worried about the trim. To answer your question, Sunny, I'm not worried about the trim fitting properly at the bottom. It's going to do what it's going to do. I don't even think about it. It just happens while I'm working. It's not something that I'm going to intentionally fight. Sorry, forgive me. I'm trying to find the piece of embroidery so that I can check and see if it's viable or not. Not entirely sure where it went. That's embarrassing. Well, I'll find it soon. Well, rather than interrupt the session too much, I'll just know that I think that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to use that piece of embroidery, provided I can find it, and I will remove one of the pieces from center front so that I can use them along the hem. I'll be right back. This is embarrassing. Darn it. It'll show up eventually. I think I'm just going to keep moving ahead with this. We'll sew the trim as it is, and then I will deal with filling in the blank spot in a little while. I think I have to turn the video off and clean the studio to be able to find that piece of embroidery. I know it's here somewhere. But I think that the skirt is going to actually look really sharp. I'm super excited about it. I can see the essence of what it's going to become. and I hope that you've really enjoyed the tutorial on how to make it. I'm going to turn the camera off while I do the stitching of this. You've already watched me do a whole lot of stitching. It's already 5 o'clock and I've been at this for a while. So I'm going to turn off the video and I'll make an announcement if I'm going to come back to it today. But most likely I will check back in tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you so much for watching.